Well, hi Adele, here we are in person.
We're in person.
Adele Theron, Sam McSorley,
Hello.
Sunny Topo,
Yeah.
New Zealand.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So we're on a Hakomi training at the moment. This is actually our final training. Super excited. Nice to be kind of wrapping that up, and we're starting our psychotherapy advanced training the end of February in Sydney, which is really cool. But yeah, we're here together, which is really fun. So we thought we'd record this particular episode together. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about PTSD.
Yeah, and it's getting more and more abundant, isn't it? So this is an area of, like, this is your specialty in work. This is your business, right? You work with PTSD, you work with trauma. So tell us, what is PTSD?
So PTSD is it's post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there's a real spectrum when we talk about PTSD. Very few people actually get diagnosed with PTSD, which is the disorder that you need to have the collection of these symptoms for at least 6 months to really be diagnosed with PTSD. For a lot of people, what they have is PTS. So you have post-traumatic symptoms following a traumatic incident. And the collection of symptoms that you have equal this particular experience that you're having. And PTS is incredibly common. In fact, if you have a traumatic experience, like 90% of us will have these symptoms, and if you have more than like 5 or 6 of them, you'll be diagnosed as having this like kind of PTS type response to things.
So what you're saying is, like, there's this normal response to stress, which is PTS, and then it moves into a disorder when it's lasting longer than 6 months.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, what's really crucial about PTSD and PTS is sometimes you can have a delayed reaction of onset. So they'll talk about delayed onset of PTSD or PTS type symptoms. So, you can have a trauma, totally dissociate through the trauma, and then like later in life, you're like living your best life, and next minute you're like frozen and you've got all these weird symptoms based on something that happened years and years ago, and it won't always make sense. But this is very common as well. And this is very common in what we call compound trauma or complex PTSD. It's when lots of things have happened that have led to this. And perhaps at the time, your body's best way of coping with that was to check out and dissociate.
Right.
But now that you're like older in life, maybe a bit more resourced, it's like now bringing it to the foreground for us to actually process and deal with it. But we get it like later.
So it can be quite slippy almost to kind of diagnose sometimes, especially if you're, I guess, that kind of robust character where you don't show how you feel, but it's still there on the surface, but you're able to keep a tight lid on it. And then over time, if you've got like an abundance of stress, boom, it gets out of the jar, and it's,
And what's really frustrating, for those of us that work psychologically in trauma, is a lot of people get misdiagnosed with another kind of pathology. They get diagnosed with having bipolar, or they borderline personality disorder or something else, which actually it's wrong. They have PTS or PTSD.
Wow.
So knowing and understanding yourself and kind of understanding yourself about the symptoms, what they are, like what's going on, is really crucial, because you might actually be living with a misdiagnosis.
Why? That's really tricky in mental health, isn't it? Because it's so easy to slip through the cracks in mental health, particularly in New Zealand. I mean, you're seeing it and hearing about it all the time. People are just falling through the cracks and really suffering a long time before they get the correct diagnosis. So what is trauma?
Well, it's a really, really good question. So if you look at the DSM-5, which is our diagnostic kind of manual that we use to diagnose PTS or PTSD, the DSM-5 would they have very clear criteria. You must have these symptoms, and trauma must look like this. There's type 1 trauma, there's type 2 trauma. But in the most recent kind of investigations and studies and people have done on trauma can be anything that creates these symptoms, right? And it's kind of, some of us can get these symptoms from something that is not in the manual diagnosed as a trauma. It could be somebody died and you get PTS, right? Could be you were tortured and you get PTS. It could be, you had a car accident or a divorce or a breakdown or bereavement, or like long-term abuse within a relationship and you get PTS. So
Yes.
there are many, many things. Whereas in the manual, it's very much like, no, it has to be this very traumatic event where we all as psychologists agree this is a traumatic event. Yeah, the nature of the actual event itself is no longer relevant.
Right.
You as a person and your own background and who you are, if you have quite a sensitive disposition or character strategy, you might develop PTS from something that like we wouldn't agree is a trauma.
Yes, yeah, right,
it could be
right.
from anything.
Yeah, because I look at my own experience of that where it was probably PTS, but never diagnosed as PTS. But we had the Christchurch earthquakes and I lost 12 colleagues in there. Our house was a write-off. I had a marriage breakup. I was doing my master's. I miscarried twins. And then I was just that I wasn't coping.
100%.
Because it wasn't one particular trauma, but I was managing each one individually, but it was that melting pot as a collective. Yeah, right. But it took years for it to catch up with me.
Yeah. And you would probably have been diagnosed with depression or anxiety or postnatal depression or like,
exactly.
and this is the thing that's frustrating. We often joke about how like general practitioners don't get like sufficient menopause training, right?
Yeah.
In the same way that a lot of psychologists don't get sufficient trauma training.
Right.
And being really trauma informed is a very specific branch of psychology.
You can imagine.
And if you're not trauma informed, you are at risk of misdiagnosing people with like a whole collection of like things that are out there when actually they have unresolved and unprocessed trauma.
Yeah.
And by processing that trauma, their symptoms disappear.
And so what are the symptoms? What would you expect to see?
Well, I've actually got the list because I want it to be really like clear.
Yeah.
So if you and yourself in your life are experiencing like across the different like qualities, several of these kinds of symptoms, it might be that you've had a misdiagnosis and you actually are suffering from PTS or PTSD.
Yeah.
So first things first is you have re-experiencing symptoms. So that means you have upsetting memories that come to mind when you don't want them to. So a lot of the time, we can recall things when we want to, but when things just pop into your head based on an environmental trigger or something's happening in your environment and suddenly this memory comes rushing in that's really kind of quite disturbing and like you feel quite emotionally dysregulated as a result of that.
Yeah. That's
a re-experiencing symptom.
Yeah.
Next is it's very intense kind of memory where it feels like this whole thing is happening to me again. I'm like back there, so that the ability to distinguish between past and present evaporates. So you actually back in the trauma when this thing occurs.
And I know that we're going to touch on like what happens in the neurophysiology of the brain and why that happens.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So nightmares of the event, and they usually have quite a threatening theme and feeling physically and emotionally upset whenever you're reminded of the trauma. So you'll have avoidance symptoms to try and avoid talking about the trauma because it'll be really upsetting for you. So that's like those avoidance symptoms are really important, staying away from triggers, staying away from reminders. And for a lot of people that I kind of work with, their life kind of gets smaller and smaller and more closed down.
So the isolation.
They kind of isolate. They don't want to go out and get triggered, right? Or you'll avoid a whole bunch of stuff that you've never avoided before, Like I had a diving accident and, my instructor was like, get back in the water right now, because if you don't, like, you will never be able to it will become a whole trigger where it's like a whole thing you can never get over. In the same way you fall off a horse, they always say get back on the horse for the same reason. You can end up with that huge avoidance thing.
Yeah, right. Makes sense.
Next is hyperarousal. So the vigilance, constantly checking, scanning, problems sleeping, problems concentrating, problems with memory in particular, feeling angry, frightened, and then depression, anxiety, irritability, withdrawing from family and friends, combined with like a feeling of guilt, self-blame, or shame. And shame is the big one.
Yeah, and you can see why people would get misdiagnosed with like a standard depression, if you like, and given SSRIs. And of course, that's going to help some of the issue of PTSD.
Yeah,
but it's not even scratching the surface because the trauma is so embedded in the body and in the emotional brain.
That's right.
Yeah. And so risk factors.
Yeah,
there's so many risk factors.
You're kind of I think this is definitely your topic because, like, being with that kind of naturopathic lens and all the study you've done in health and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Are we genetic, or some of us genetically disposed to actually develop PTS?
Absolutely, yeah. So we do have various genes, and we've got one in particular, like the SLA6AC, which is about how you're, and then we've got, yeah, I know, this is how your body uses serotonin. And so if you've got, say, SNPs or some kind of mutation there, or genetic disposition, you might have the gene there, but the trauma causes it to express itself. So yeah, there's definitely a genetic disposition, which also brings us into like environmental factors. So there's varied environmental factors. So low education levels, one of them. If you're female, you're twice as likely to suffer from PTSD. Previous trauma exposure, which you've touched on, lack of social support, isolation, so living on your own. And it's quite interesting when you look at the blue zones of the world, and I think there's about 7 blue zones in the world now where they have this longevity, is that they don't seem to experience PTSD because they have this social structure of support. Like, it's quite tribal living. And that's one of the key things. It's not the food they're eating, it's the social constructs and structures that they have within their tribal living, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, the list goes on. A first degree relative with PTSD is a risk factor as well. Quality of immediate support is critical. So if you get the right support in your diagnosis of PTS that moves into PTSD, you are more likely to recover from it. So yeah, there's a massive amount of environmental factors, but I thought it was really interesting looking at that female component, that you're twice as likely to get it. And then you start to think, wow, was there an endocrine hormonal part to play in this as well? And
there's been studies that have shown that when women in particular are going through menopausal shift, and when girls are going through puberty, right? So the rewiring of the brain from the estrone to the estradiol system, and then the reverse rewiring from menopause to estradiol back to estrone, the PTS and PTSD numbers go up.
Yeah, because of course your brain is changing, and we don't think of our brain as having, estrogen receptors, but our brain is full of estrogen receptors. Like, it's in the hippocampus, it's in the hypothalamus, it's involved in memory formation, and so that could be part of that as well. Like, when you look at the hippocampi, because there's, it's both in the right and the left hemisphere, is that, yeah, that makes total sense, doesn't it? That somewhere along the line there's possibly memories being pulled back up when you become perimenopausal, postmenopausal. So women get a bit of a raw deal there, But yeah, it's so I'm really curious now. Like, we're just touching on, we seem to move into this quite nicely. Like, what happens in the brain? Like, that's fascinating.
So before I talk about what happens in the brain, let's talk about how we make memory, because understanding exactly like how we make memory, I want you to really get, like, if you have PTS and PTSD, it is not your fault. It is a function of the brain. Your brain is kind of just doing its best to get to safety. So it's not a pathology in that, like, there are genetic components where you're predisposed to getting PTS or PTSD based on your reaction and your ability to self-regulate. But it's very much a case that it's not your fault. Like, your brain is just doing what it's best. Right? So normal memory versus a trauma memory. So trauma memory, first things first, very, very different to a normal memory. Okay. A normal memory has a beginning, middle, and an end. You can recall a bit of it, like there's okay, I'll just tell you the middle. Well, I'll just tell you the end.
Oh, yeah,
right? You rewind the tape and can play the tape based on where you want to, right?
Yeah.
You know it's in the past where it belongs.
Yeah.
It doesn't disturb you at night or whatever. It's like in your filing cabinets, in the sensory cortex, just living there. And it's like, I'm cool over here. Like, I don't need to think about this thing. A trauma memory, it comes to you when you're triggered in like 2 p.m.
Smells, the olfactory. Yeah, right.
2 p.m. in the afternoon.
Yeah.
You have a smell.
Yeah.
Right? You see a red car.
Hear a bit of music.
Something happens in your environment and this thing just comes flooding in. You don't have a beginning, middle, and end of it. You have a bit of it, a flashback of it. So the memory is bitsy, it's pieces, it's images that flood into the brain and they don't make sense. And as they're flooding into the brain, you don't have an ability to have a beginning, middle, and ending to it.
Because you're in that hyperarousal state then, aren't you?
Correct.
That whole HPA axis is activated.
100% activated. And where it's activated, so we now go to like what's actually happening within the brain. It's all based on our alarm system and that mechanism in the brain, which is kind of governed by the HPA axis and involves the amygdala. So the amygdala is a very old portion of the brain. It's designed to get, be the alarm system. I call it my hysterical, like, secretary, the one that's like,
that's a good one.
It's just alarm, and it's running around and it's just going absolutely ballistic. And then I have the other part of my brain, which is a very calm, astute, kind of quite snooty librarian called the hippocampus, right? And these two work together to basically form a proper memory.
Yeah, right.
Okay. But the problem is the amygdala is where the trauma and emotional memories live.
Yes.
Okay. It's kind of like, so when you have something traumatic happen to you, like you've been in a car accident or, you were held at gunpoint or something like that, the amygdala, it basically takes over. Alarm, activating the HPA axis, rush out the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, all that kind of stuff, and basically get us to safety. It helps you fight, flee, freeze, fawn, the major kind of things to actually get you to safety. Now, the problem is that moment lives in the amygdala. Now, the amygdala, because it's like freaking out all over the place, its job is to go to the librarian and go, okay, everything's calmed down now. That happened a few weeks ago. Let's actually put it into the filing cabinet of the sensory cortex.
Oh.
But it cannot do that. Why? The main reason it cannot do that is as this hysterical secretary is running around, spreading lots of adrenaline to kind of get us to safety.
Spreading fires.
The cortisol levels increase to a chronic point. Now, some of that is genetically controlled, and some of that is just based on our predisposition or the extent of the actual trauma that we've experienced. Cortisol levels go to such a high level, and when cortisol is too high, it suppresses the working of the hippocampus. So the librarian ain't there. Or she's there, but she's like,
she can't get in.
Yeah, can't get in. You can't talk to her. You can't do anything with her. So what happens is the trauma memory remains a trauma memory.
Right.
Yeah. And then if you are being triggered, right, you're walking around, suddenly you see a red car, you're triggered, you start experiencing all the PTS or PTSD type symptoms.
Yeah.
And there's your hippocampus. It's not online. You are reliving this thing as if it's happening right now.
And then you're in this cascade event because you can't get out of it because now you're in this hyperarousal state. And once you're in that hyperarousal state and the amygdala still can't regulate itself, it's difficult to get out of. So you can see the suffering that it can cause.
Huge suffering.
So from this hyperarousal state, what you can expect to see is that there's no time to eat because I'm running from the lion and the tiger, right? You can't sleep because you're on high alert. So they've got this high alert, haven't you? So everything is in this fright and flight. You're stuck, you're frozen in time.
Yeah. And what's really like, Stephen Porges did a really important piece of work, which I've spoken about before, but it's a piece of work that actually shows how we behave when we are triggered, like what is actually happening with our nervous system. So in your autonomic nervous system, you got two parts. You got the sympathetic nervous system, which controls this fight or flight or fix kind of mechanism.
Yeah.
And you got parasympathetic nervous system, which has two sides. So it's got the ventral vagal, which is when we're sweet, rest and digest, we're in a good space, we're cruising.
Yeah.
But you get the dorsal vagal, which is the other side of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is where we freeze or fawn. So what happens is we're fine, we're cruising in life, this trauma hits, activates the sympathetic nervous system. We are fighting, we are fleeing, we are fixing, we're doing all the things. But now we can't calm down, right? The secretary is like, she's loose. She's cruising around and bad things are happening when she's going mental. They're experiencing all the symptoms. But as that happens, it's like your tolerance, your window of tolerance starts to close. And when that window of tolerance starts to close, you're not down regulating. You're not resourced enough to actually handle what's happening. So you move to the next trigger. That next trigger is where we collapse into the dorsal vagal space, where we freeze or fawn. And in some traumas can cause this full move from sympathetic straight into that dorsal vagal response.
All right.
Because the trauma is so
Great.
Intense. So sexual trauma, complex, like being tortured or like, you know, some kind of violent attacks. So these, you know, DSM-5 type 1 type traumas can really cause that straight out.
And then compounding traumas like repeated rape or repeated torture or wow, it's complex, isn't it? It's really
complex. And what's so important, I always say this to everybody that I work with, it's like, is don't be ashamed, particularly if you've been a victim of sexual violence or some kind of thing where you're torturing yourself for, I should have done X, I could have done Y, like why, like, so when you're on shame response where you're kind of beating yourself up for something you think you should have done under that trauma. So I should have swerved the car, I should have saved the baby, I should have did it.
You do hear that a lot, don't you?
You got to get, like, your brain literally just took over and it calculated, we're going straight to dissociation, man. We're just going to freeze or fawn here.
Yeah.
So that freeze or fawn response is, we can't do anything.
No.
You've collapsed.
And then also that dissociation that we get, which is a normal response to huge amounts of stress, right?
Huge.
That's a way of coping in the world. So this body, this innate intelligence that our body has and our brain has, and I'm going to talk about them, you know, that they are one, but we think of them as separate. So I'm just going to talk to that. But we think of, you know, it's incredible. And so you can come across somebody who's got depression or anxiety and, you know, they're not quite with you, they're not wanting to engage with you, but actually what they're doing is survival. So they're now in full survival mode. And it's really difficult to get out of that. So then when they're still in this hyperarousal state, right, because the amygdala is online, the hippocampus is offline, then you've got flashbacks, nightmares, the dissociation that we've talked about, how it affects relationships at all levels, your intimate relationships, your working relationships, your friendships, family, like it's huge.
It is huge. And it's not your fault.
No.
Right? Your brain is just doing the best that it can to get to safety. And when we are in that kind of coping mechanism world, like, we didn't choose the coping mechanism, right? That go-to that we went to, your brain actually calculated that. So studies and evidence have actually shown that it's not often conscious, which is really crucial when we kind of shame people that choose bad coping mechanisms, you know. We're like, weren't actually in a place of choice.
No,
right?
They were in a place of survival.
Yeah. And that's why it's called a survival resource, is that when you're in that place of survival and you need to survive, you're going to just pick a go-to. Now, some of the go-tos we pick, you know, the world would say, that's a really good go-to. I'm so glad you picked being a workaholic. Good work there. You know, you're a people pleaser. Good work there. Nice. You like beat people up and you're really angry and have angry outbursts, or like you take lots of drugs or alcohol, you know, abuse and that kind of thing. And now you're a bad person. It's like, that place of choice is really important. And
that's one thing I think we need to consider, that PTSD, like you can see domestic violence on the increase if somebody's got PTSD. And, you know, it's like the harm that it causes, but there's this massive misunderstanding on what it is. And so the effective treatments, like there's a lot of effective treatments for it, right? But it's finding the gateway to get those treatments can be a problem for many.
It can be,
depending on your social your geographically social
you might be geographically like isolated, or you might not be able to afford therapy. And you know, just a few caveats though in saying, you know, if somebody in that place of having PTS or PTSD, unconsciously their brain selects a survival mechanism that isn't great, yes, it shouldn't be used as an excuse to therefore commit like violent acts against another.
No,
right? It's not okay to kind of go there. So it's like, it might not be your fault that like your brain chose this pathway.
Exactly.
But it's still your responsibility.
Yeah, that's right. Because you do have to treat it like it's a brain injury.
Yeah.
You really do. And so, you know, it's finding the right help and support for that.
Yeah. Or at least educating yourself. You know, there's a lot of resources
because the collateral damage is huge.
Yeah.
So effective treatments. So we have touched on EMDR, and so tell us about that.
So let's back up before EMDR. So originally, when, you know, a lot of us who are trauma therapists we were trained in kind of the older therapies, like when I first got trained, prolonged exposure, right? Trauma-informed CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, enhanced reliving, which is a kind of more advanced level of cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, narrative exposure, you know, these kinds of, and there was a slight like kind of, okay, to get over trauma, you must brace yourself and live through your trauma once again, which is, you know, it's pretty oh my God, it was quite hectic doing trauma therapy in the beginning because like people were like having breakdowns and all that kind of stuff. So it was sort of this label that the therapy itself was quite violent, and it was, you know, you needed to be brave and strong. And I think that's why a lot of people avoided trauma therapy, was it was kind of a little bit too violent. But you can see the mechanism, because what they were trying to do was let's have a great therapeutic relationship. Let's bring up this thing that was awful, but you're in a more self-regulated place where your hippocampus is online.
Yeah.
And let's see if we can get those trauma memories in, like, and process them to make a normal memory out of what happened.
Yeah.
Right. That's like the mechanism of the therapy.
Yeah.
But it was just, it was like, I don't know, like being in a cowboy shooting match or so. It was like quite hectic. So luckily things have progressed from there. And the first beginning of that was the kind of compassion focused trauma therapy, where it was really kind of like the lens of like, let's be kinder, let's be nicer.
And let's try and understand this more as well.
And kind of just like, let's soften a little bit towards this. And I think this kind of happened when people started to really realize that a lot of the survival resources that people choose are not really chosen by people. So then it moved into EMDR. So EMDR is Edna Foa's brilliant piece of work. It feels a lot like when you're doing it and when you're receiving it, it's a bit like hocus pocus. You're like watching this dot across the screen, and like, but it's pretty awesome. Like particularly I find for traumas that have a visual component. So like if you have a motorcycle accident, or like you've been in something where there's a lot of flashbacks, you're experiencing a lot of flashbacks.
Seeing an accident.
You know, so it's very good with visuals because it's based on an image, like having a positive part of an image and negative part of an image, and you're kind of doing an almost neurolinguistic programming kind of hocus pocus.
So it's almost like if I just do a little kind of like, I get you to think of the situation that's caused your PTSD, and then I do this, and then you've got to track with my finger. Is that how it works?
Well, basically what you're doing is you bring up the image that is negative. And then you watch the dot on the screen. And you just got to kind of breathe and self-regulate, and then you report back. And every time you go through this process of kind of like moving your eyes back and forth, what's actually happening, what they found in the research, is that the movement of the eyes actually like soothes the body. There's something about that movement that actually like calms people. There's a lot more research than that. I'm not going to go in depth, but basically, and then it's like moving it from the negative image into the positive image. So what it's doing is it's doing something called image rescripting. So it's quite a clever kind of technique. And I think that's why like a lot of, you know, hospitals and medical kind of institutes and psychologists are trained in EMDR, because it's pretty groovy. But then there are other kinds of forms. So I started getting trained in clinical hypnotherapy and timeline therapy, because this is where they started realizing we've got to bring it up, but it's got to be this like really gentle thing. And timeline therapy, you actually move very far away from the event. So you're studying the event down there. And you're surfing above on a timeline. And the more dysregulated, you just keep going up. We just look way further down and just like study this thing down here. That was very effective. But now, like the most advanced trauma therapies that we all use now are all sensory motor psychotherapy type traumas. So it's kind of understanding that the complexity of trauma doesn't just live in the brain and the cognition piece. Rescripting is actually it's part of the body. It's emotional as well. So this is where therapies like internal family systems, Hakomi, have really like played a massive role moving forward in trauma therapy, and particularly, well, Hakomi is amazing for developmental trauma.
Yes,
and IFS and working with parts, and Hakomi also works with parts therapy, so it sort of has both. And then the IFS type thing is really good at understanding when a trauma happens, we fracture off into parts, and like, what are the parts doing,
and what are those parts, how they kind of organize themselves in association with that trauma as well. And each of those parts has a voice and a story to tell and a different experience, because those memories are formed. I mean, the mind is not mono, is it? So they're all formed in different and have a different story to tell. So it's quite fascinating. And I think that's where also Hakomi sits well, is because we're interested in the felt experience and where the memory was stored in the body, because it's a somatic response.
100%. But also, like, what's been found in the literature is that it's not the trauma. It's often not the trauma itself that traumatizes people. It's been left alone in the trauma.
Yes,
which goes back to your kind of blue zone piece, because it's like, in those communities where community is there to support, you're not left alone with your trauma, and you actually have someone supporting you through that. The chance of you developing PTS or PTSD is reduced.
Because we, as we've said, that if you get treatment as early as you can, then the outcomes are better. Not to say, just a caveat in that as well, is that if you do leave it for like a couple of decades, there is still a lot of hope for recovering from PTSD.
Oh, definitely.
With the right effective treatment.
I mean, I had a client a few years ago who was 82 years old, and she was finally ready to process her compound PTSD, and it was beautiful. Like, you can be any age and kind of, all right, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and go have a look at this. And
I'm ready now. And what was the motivation at 82 to come in?
Closure.
Closure.
It was kind of quite beautiful, and like, she really achieved that in her life, which was nice.
And the other effective treatment I want to look at is that we're putting together this trauma diet, and of course a trauma diet is around how we can reduce inflammation in the body and support a hyper arousal state. And so that is done through foods. Like, if you're going to have pro-inflammatory foods, you're going to keep a hyper arousal state, because it really is quite bad for you.
Why? I think just kind of tell us a little bit about what the problem is with inflammation. When you're going through this kind of.
So we have to treat PTSD like it's a brain injury, okay? And what we know from conditions like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, head injuries, that if you do lumbar punctures, you can find interleukins in there that shouldn't be there, right? So we've got this cytokine response that's happening in the brain, and you have cytokines in your brain, that's supposed to happen, but they're at levels that aren't healthy. So you've got like this para-inflammation that's happening in the brain. So you have to treat it like it's an inflammation of the brain. And I'm not wanting to alarm anybody, like if you were to, just don't worry about that. But these studies have been done on other mammals, and also there's been a few human studies done on chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, where you've got this para-inflammation in the brain, and they also have quite similar symptoms, where they can get, like, especially with fibromyalgia, that they've got this hyperarousal state, they can't sleep, they've got this somatic stuff, and often they've had a trauma as well, fibromyalgic people, as chronic fatigue people have. Another caveat, it can be viral and all sorts of other things, but there's evidence to show that there's also some kind of trauma. So by looking at a low inflammatory diet, you're reducing that cytokine load in the system systemically overall. So a trauma diet is where we're looking at all the colours you can get on your plate, good healthy proteins, not processed proteins like cooked hams and salamis, like
bacon.
Or bacon, that's not too much bacon, said anybody ever, but but things like your nice lean red meats, ostrich, lovely lean meats, fish, chicken, eat organic where you can. But looking at what happens to your body when it's in this inflammatory state, you can get all sorts of atopic conditions, skin conditions. Like PTSD presents itself physically in quite, creative ways. You've got IBS. IBS is another term for, you've got a really irritable bowel, but I don't really know what's going on, but you can get bowel issues. So really focusing on the diet, and then really focusing on what kind of supplements you can take. So you're really looking at supplements that will support the nervous system. So one of my key minerals for supporting the nervous system, firstly, is zinc. People think magnesium, but zinc is key. And then that goes back to like a genetic disposition. Like you've got metallothionein genes that are dependent on zinc, and metallothionein genes are required for neurotransmitter activity. And so zinc's one of the key minerals that I like to look at, looking at magnesium, looking at vitamin D, because vitamin D is also classed as like a hormone because of its role in the system. Looking at your B vitamins, so just really supporting the nervous system. And of course, you can do genetic testing to see which B vitamins suit your disposition better rather than just doing this kind of approach, right? Being more bespoke. And then of course there's herbs, where we can work with the HPA axis, like quite specifically. And the research,
you mean like the adaptogenic
herbs and nervine herbs, like the research in herbal medicine is just the what's there now is absolutely primo. And I always like to talk about Professor Kerry Bone, who's just the wisdom that he has with herbal medicine is just incredible. Google him, YouTube him, Professor Kerry Bone. But adaptogens like ashwagandha, also called withania, rhodiola, rhamania. We're looking at nervines like passion flower, Californian poppy, holy basil. Like there's just so many herbs. And what I like about herbs is that they have like a 5-pronged approach. So you go, that's like withania is adaptogenic, but it's called withania somnifera because it makes you soporific. So it's really quite nice for sleeping at night. Somnolence, makes you tired. And so, you can look at the herbs of the names of these herbs, and it gives you some kind of clue as to what they also do. But, and of course there's medications, seeing your GP, getting the medications that you may need. Like you may need something to help you sleep, because getting to sleep is just a real issue for you. And I think sleeping is one of the first things to focus on, because it's about healing your brain. And it's just, what's keeping this PTSD going. And so I think it's a melting pot of support: herbal medicine, nutritional medicine, the trauma diet, getting the most effective treatment, whether that be EMDR, Hakomi, internal family systems, having a nice tribe around you. And of course, that's not accessible to everybody, is it? So,
And I think I really loved you kind of talking about it, treating this as a brain injury. I mean, we're not saying there's like literally a diagnosis here that you're a brain injury.
No.
But by coming from that place, right, with like understanding that the mechanism is because the amygdala and hippocampus aren't talking to each other. So that's kind of like an injury, right? And by treating it this way and being delicate, you can follow some of the protocols in how traumatic brain injuries also get healed. I mean, when I was doing my master's in health psychology, we were looking at TBIs in particular. And what I was really fascinated in is that the original injury isn't often the problem with a traumatic brain injury. It's the secondary injury cascade. And I think what Sam's really talking about here, which is so important with PTS and why it gets so misdiagnosed by being something else, is because you have that base thing that happened, and then there's this injury cascade that follows from that, where you get IBS. A lot of people, for example, that get diagnosed with autoimmune conditions have unresolved and unprocessed trauma. People that have lupus, people that have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or the things that have happened
endometriosis there's been some research there around sexual assault and endometriosis. We can't discount looking at this as a holistic model for its treatment. Because of its systemic response in the body.
And I think what we're really saying is like, so if you find yourself in this place, or you have PTS or PTSD, it's like really take your recovery seriously. Look at your diet, definitely cut out alcohol, for at least 6 months. alcohol is a huge destabilizer for the recovery. Like, it doesn't help with brain injuries or brain kind of miscommunication.
The absorption of nutrients, it's
just it's just not a good move. Even though in the moment it might make you feel better, you're just kicking the ball down the fence. At some stage, like, it's going to be a problem. Sugar.
Yes.
Cortisol loves sugar, feeds off sugar. It dysregulates even further when it has more sugar within the body.
Causes insulin resistance, which is an inflammatory state. It just, you know what I mean? It's just like looking at this as a holistic model for treatment.
So looking at all those kind of diet pieces, looking at some of those supplements that Sam was talking about, getting yourself some treatment or getting yourself educated. There's resources on my website that you can just download which are all like, this is what PTSD, this is some of the stuff you can do about it, and you can just, for free, just go for it. But it's kind of like empowering yourself and treating yourself a little bit like a double edge. So on the one hand, treating yourself as an athlete and then treating yourself as a patient. And what I mean by that is, when you're treating yourself like an athlete, sometimes you got to kick your own ass. You got to be like, right, we're not drinking alcohol, we're not having sugar, we're going to eat like, low inflammatory foods. We're going to like do our kind of therapy. We're going to do our narrative exposure. We're going to do the things that we know we need to do. But then there are other moments where you've got to have that compassionate lens of being the patient and allow yourself, like, be kind to yourself and gentle.
And this is like the havening technique, isn't it? Where you just you can self-soothe. But when you say like treat yourself like an athlete, like that's another thing. Like just to touch before we finish. I know that we're close to finishing, but exercise, whether it's walking for 10 minutes, because what we do know about exercise is that it does increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor,
100%.
which increases and supports neuroplasticity in the brain. And that's one of the things that we really want to focus on. And again, some of those herbs I mentioned, they support neuroplasticity of the brain. So
beautiful. Well, that comes to the end of another episode. And in the next time, we're going to be talking about training our minds in compassion around trauma, because I think the shame piece it's one of the hardest emotions to actually reprocess and recover from. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that next time.
That'd be great, because a lot of people with PTSD feel a lot of shame about their behavior and how they're being in the world, and so that's going to be really nice just to thread on to today. But it was so nice to do it in person with you. And next time we'll be at opposite ends of the country again next week. But till then, we look forward to seeing you and using all the things health, relationship, and trauma.
Awesome. Till next time. Bye. The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counseling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.